Much like an awful lot of people out there, I have a great affinity for Christopher Nolan's trilogy. And I know this because obviously the movies will then become not only successful commercially, critically, they become almost a mainstay of pop culture, not just for the character of Batman, but also for Nolan's career. It's because of those movies where he is at right now that every movie that he releases is pretty much a tent pole and we're guaranteed to see it. And it's not lost on me that this year, along with Revenge of the Sith, we got the 20-year anniversary of the one that started it all, the one that arguably put Nolan on the mainstream map. Because prior to this, he had a couple of films that did garner him critical acclaim, to the point of at least getting at least one Oscar nomination in the screenwriting category. But it was really Batman Begins that made everybody go, hold up, who's this guy that's reinventing this, or at least maybe not the superhero genre, but rather the Batman mythology to his own style and the way that he wanted to bring that character back to its roots. And now here we are at the eve, or rather at the cusp of 20 years of that film having been released. And in doing so, it also reminded me, holy shit, there was a PS2 game. Yes, this was still the mid-2000s when there were an awful lot of movies getting movie tie-in games to promote it, and to kind of give at least some up-and-coming developers a chance to kind of flex their muscles in the development space and whatnot. So, being that recently I covered Arkham City, and my unpopular opinion of preferring Arkham Asylum over City, and with the 10-year anniversary of Arkham Knight just around the horizon, thought to myself, before I finally go deep, very balls deep into my playthrough for Arkham Knight to get ready for that anniversary retrospective video, thought to myself, you know what? Let me boot up this nice little emulator that I have on my gaming slash content creating PC, boot up a ROM of the PlayStation 2 Batman Begins video game, and see exactly what it is that I missed out. Upon booting up the game, I instantly got the huge mid-2000s flair just completely wafting into me very unapologetically, from the bombastic music to the instant movie tie-in vibes of the UI with the oversized font, the very garish backgrounds as far as that yellow and the squares trying to mimic that of the Bat computer, the music and the bats in the cave and the main menu going crazy, while at the same time you have Batman's little character model right there doing that heavy breathing thing that an awful lot of character models outside of just movie tie-ins, just video games in general, were doing back in the early to mid 2000s, where all of a sudden they're doing this in order to simulate that they're breathing because they weren't able to fine-tune those animations to be a little bit more on the nuanced side. But that's one thing that I was kind of expecting. What I was not expecting, and I don't know if this is a problem with the emulated version of this game, or maybe this was also existent on the actual on-disc versions of this game back on the PS2 and even GameCube, and even I think it also released on Xbox, where you have these like quadrant lines kind of dividing quite literally the screen, the 4x3 screen, into quadrants. And I noticed that this was very prevalent whenever there were either menus or in-game cutscenes. When the gameplay was happening, they instantly disappeared. And I thought that it was like a pervasive thing. I thought to myself, maybe it's the ROM that I got. Maybe I need to, cycle through a different one and kind of consider my options. But then I noticed that it would disappear in actual solid sessions of the gameplay. And so I thought to myself, is this something that was just baked into the engine? So for those of you who did manage to play this game back 20 years ago, on those existing consoles, whether it be GameCube, PS2, Xbox, let me know down below if that was also present in your playthrough, if you can even remember. Upon starting up the game, you instantly get like these little montaged bits of clips from the actual 2005 Christopher Nolan movie, and a little bit more than I was anticipating, to the point where I thought to myself, you kind of guys are teetering on spoilery territory with some of these images and screens that they would show, more so than the standards of Christopher Nolan himself would allow these days, because considering how secretive he is about his projects, to where you barely get a taste of what's really going on with some of the more very, involved, very plot heavy, very mysterious heavy stuff like Tenet and Inception. Remember how very minimalist those trailers really were? Well, that's a far cry from what you really get in some of these clips that played throughout the campaign of the game in the Batman Begins tie-in, because like I said, they legit show some stuff that otherwise I thought to myself, did Nolan really approve this? But then you also have to consider that Emma Thomas, who not only produced the film, also had a little bit of an oversight on the production of this game. So if it was cool with her, I guess it was alright. And at the end of the day, it's there to also promote the film, which was released quite literally on the exact same day. So it's kind of a win-win situation for everybody involved. But except for maybe the devs, because immediately I noticed a few of the rough edges that very much harken back to that mid-2000s movie tie-in template that you come to expect when booting up a game like this. This is, after all, a year after the Spider-Man 2 video game, so you are going to have those little quirks that are almost inevitable to come across, such as the ragdoll effects. The disproportionate character models are completely in full effect. Physics and movement are a little bit exaggerated. I would even argue that sometimes they're a little bit worse than what I remember in other movie tie-in games, some of which are a little bit on the better side. Like I mentioned before, despite my bias, Spider-Man 2, you had the ragdoll effects, but at least you had some, I don't know, some attention to detail as far as the character movements. Here, everything is just going crazy as far as the rig that they got going on, that I'm like, I understand that mocap was kind of at its infancy and they wanted to save it for movie production, but they couldn't have spared a couple of instances for making this game. Though props for having the tutorial segment of this game taking place in what is effectively a flash forward, very unconventional for how the film has tackled that material, because we're obviously going to be privy to the fact that childhood trauma and court proceedings that take up the bulk of the first hour of Batman Begins the movie, we're not going to make great material for the game. And so we start with a flash forward of Batman infiltrating Scarecrow's warehouse, and things go awry there, but at least it serves as a good, like I said, template to get you into the habit of how combat moves, how traversal is, how detective works, how all the pillars that traditionally make a Batman works within this early movie tie-in game, before harkening it back to the roots as to what made Bruce Wayne turn into Batman. Which happens after Batman gets a dose of Scarecrow's toxin, goes out the window just like he does in the movie, but this time we flash back to his training in the Himalayas with Ducard and the League of Shadows. And here you get a little bit more taste of the fundamentals, the way that shuriokens or throwables are done, as far as well scaling and traversing the environment, climbing, roping, grappling, etc. But I'm sorry, it was a little difficult to pay attention to any of that stuff after noting that even in the mid-2000s they were able to afford Liam the Goat Neeson to actually voice Ducard during this segment. I was like, that's unmistakably Liam Neeson, and it's crazy to think that, yeah, this was still back in the mid-2000s where movie tie-in games were still seen as a form of a business venture, an opportunity, so to speak, for several character actors, and that definitely didn't, like, dissuade any actors to look at a movie tie-in game and be like, I'm above that. No, they got legitimately the bulk of the cast here. Of course, the main guy himself, Christian Bale, is voicing Batman. You got Liam Neeson, as I mentioned, but then you also got pretty much a good chunk of the rest of the cast. You got Michael Caine as Alfred, Cillian Murphy as Scarecrow, even Tom Wilkinson as Carmine Falcone, or Falcone, however they pronounce his name. They're all mostly here, except Gary Oldman. Gary Oldman is notably absent. I don't know what the exact reasoning behind that is. You could toss it up to maybe scheduling conflicts or whatnot, but at the same time, I also noted how interesting and funny it was that his character model that pops up a little later in the campaign looks nothing like Gary Oldman, on top of the fact that it's not voiced by him. So I feel like maybe there was a bit of a rights licensing issue that they couldn't work out with Oldman. I don't know exactly what the backstory is. It's just an observation, but still, my respects to not just being able to accrue the majority of the cast, but the bulk of them are actually delivering their lines pretty nicely. There's no one that's actually kind of bad. If anything, it kind of brings us a new side to their voice cast that effectively kind of works and gives us a new shade of what we are not really given in the movie. Specifically Christian Bale, who you can kind of hear is kind of fluctuating between the heavily criticized Bruce Wayne smoker pack voice that he does, but then when he is notably not around enemies and he's simply conversating with either an ally or with Alfred, he's going with like a deeper thing, and there's a little bit of fun that you can kind of hear a little bit in Bale's voice that I almost kind of wish he would do more voice work outside of Studio Ghibli movies. But the cast is not the only people from the film that they pulled from. They actually pulled in some department heads from the film to have a bit of an influence on the game. You can kind of note this a little bit from some of the behind the scenes material that you have access to, not only the game, but also if you simply just look it up on YouTube. You'll notice that they got some powerhouses behind the film. As I already mentioned, Emma Thomas served as a producer, not just on the movie, but also as a bit of a consultant on the game to kind of see exactly what it is that they're getting right, as well as stunt coordinators, the director of photography himself, Wally Feister, however you pronounce his last name, Nathan Crowley, the production designer, and all of those different influences are definitely felt in the game as far as the aesthetic, the tone, the way that the architecture is worked here to kind of give us a little bit of the Gotham that is kind of reflected in the movie as well. And I could kind of see that a little bit with like the construction stuff and the textures and the JPEGs rather at this time of the walls and the way that everything's scaled. And then to me, I think the biggest component would have to be the lighting, how orange and brown and dirty and grimy everything is. And it's effective because I instantly see this color palette and think to myself, Batman Begins. It's very orangey, very brown, very sunsetty, but also, like I said, very grimy and dilapidated. I think of Batman Begins. And they definitely got that right, though I feel like they put these department heads just a little bit too much in the game to the point where they physically end up in the game. Spoilers, you actually get legit cameos by Emma Thomas and Wally Feister themselves. They actually put them in the game. And at first I thought that this was really strange considering, like I said, this is taken from a Nolan property that's generally meant to take itself a little more seriously than prior campier takes on the character, especially from that of Schumacher. But at the same time, it's cool to see that some of these department heads were able to loosen up a little bit to be like, yeah, I'll voice a couple of lines and put my likeness in there, and you get to beat up the director of photography. But that's the thing, is that ever so often there's moments like that I thought to myself, all right, it's very cheeky. It's having a little bit of a goof, a bit of a fun, contrary to the way that the film plays out, that is more or less straightforward serious with hints of like good sarcastic lines, that British wit that Nolan is known for writing into his scripts, that is often delivered by another great witty British actor, Michael Caine, when he's playing his Alfred lines. But at the same time, contrary to that film, the game does have a bit of a tonal crisis where it's kind of fluctuating back and forth a little too frequently. It definitely takes itself a little bit more unserious than the film itself, a bit more tongue-in-cheek. You have, like I said, these cameos not only by some of these department heads, but then you have some other line deliveries from some of the henchmen that harken back to that of the Arkham series, which has yet to be birthed by this point in the timeline. But then you also have, like I said, these one-liners said by Bale himself playing Batman, and you're having these slight Batman Forever, Batman and Robin kind of moments, and you think to yourself, again, I'm wondering this whole time, did Nolan approve this? Leading to then an awful lot of other unintentionally hilarious moments with the NPCs, whether it be because of some of the physics mechanics in-game inside of the engine, or maybe some stuff happening with the NPCs that I had no control over. And granted, this led to some hilarious moments. Trust me, this game is just so hilarious, but probably not in the fullest capacity that they truly wanted it to be. But it's one thing for the tone to be shifted in a much more comedic direction. It's then another for the game to then go into the direction of practically being a Michael Bay movie, because the tone is thrown in for yet another loop when you introduce the Tumbler segments, which you think to yourself, yeah, Batman Begins games should have Batmobile Tumbler segments. But when the actual tone and the aesthetic of these segments reminds me that of like Burnout, when I'm playing the Burnout games, from the way you crash into these vehicles and you have like this slow-mo cam to show the destruction, gaining points for doing some of these destructive collisions, as well as also, like I said, throwing in this very bombastic, very 2000s techno beat. Again, something that you did not find at all in Batman Begins the movie. I'm like, who did? Definitely someone, whoever was on that dev team, loved the Burnout, and they said to themselves, wouldn't it be cool if we had Burnout segments but with the Tumbler? Toss that in. Why? Because it's in there. Albeit these Tumbler moments, there's spoilers, only 2 of them, really, and so they don't necessarily do too much. They're very obvious in how 2000-ish they feel, but they don't really take up that much time of the campaign. The bulk of the campaign, you're playing as Batman, and you're doing your Batman stuff that he's known for, as far as the combat, as far as the espionage, as far as the traversal, and a little bit of stealth. Not a whole lot of real detective work as far as what the systems allow here. And I'll toss that up to being a little bit hamstringing the resources, because after all, this is a movie tie-in game, and when it comes to movie tie-in games, you do have that deadline. And I feel like that's probably one of the compromises the dev team had to do, is that maybe if they could have explored the whole detective angle of being able to like pick apart things in the environment, they probably would have, but that sadly may or may not have had to have gone. And all that would be fine, except that your core loop of gameplay, which effectively relies on the combat, started off pretty nicely as far as introducing you to punches, kicks, being able to guard, and then being able to pull off these timely counters by holding the guard button while at the same time pressing one of the face buttons to counter at the right moment, as well as being able to use the bumpers to then trigger some of your gadgets, some of the things that can hopefully turn the tide in your side, in your favor. But after a little while, this whole infrastructure of the combat started to get repetitive. I just felt like I was mashing some of the buttons. I didn't really see an awful lot of animation variety. And I understand that this is meant to be a movie tie-in game. And again, another thing that could be tossed up to the time constraints to get this thing done out the door, shipped by the time that the movie came out. But it's just a shame that we've seen some other superhero-ish games come out around this time, some of which are even movie tie-in games, still being able to deliver on upgrade systems and mechanics and things like that, as far as introducing us to new combat variety. Again, animations, combinations of punches and kicks and maneuvers that spice things up, and I started to feel like that spice was completely wearing out just a handful of hours into the campaign, to where I'm like, all right, here's this batch of enemies, punch, 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 maybe a couple of kicks, but I'm just trying to have that little prompt saying finishing move or finish come up on the screen so I can press it and then just move on. I was always thinking about just wanting to move on, and that's never a really great thing when you're trying to highlight the combat. On top of that, the scaling and the grappling and the maneuverability, it's all very contextual. I never really had a good sense of exploration. I mean, ever so often there's maybe like a corner that you can kind of run or creep past, but at the same time, most of the time when you're trying to think to yourself, you have like an agency over the way that you maybe can climb a wall or a pipe or anything like that. It's very contextual. Like instantly, Batman will then grab onto a wall and kind of creep alongside it, or maybe being able to climb up a pipe in the most awkward way imaginable. The way that the animation that he climbs with is just so ugly. It's one of the ugliest things that I've ever seen. And then on top of that, it really doesn't help that it just feels wonky. It feels very floaty. And on the subject of floatiness, being able to glide with the cape is sometimes kind of 50-50 as far as whether or not you're going to actually land on target. And speaking of landing on target, it's almost like the game starts to kind of cave into itself as the campaign started to rumble towards its third act, and that started to bleed into the combat. Certain punches weren't landing, the camera going crazy. And after a little while, I'm starting to think to myself, like, oh boy, here we go. One of the main staples of, like I said, those mid-2000s movie tie-in games, where after a little while, it just feels like I said, that deadline is rapidly approaching and the budget's starting to get tighter. We start to have to wrap these things up rather quickly. That, like I said, I, as the player, was then starting to feel that myself. And the only thing that was kind of putting things at a bit of at a much more thought-provoking state was whenever you got into a room that then had enemies with weapons, because this game does have at least a self-awareness to itself that Batman is, after all, still human, and he needs to outsmart his enemies, especially when they have SMGs and Uzis and pistols, and those things often result in one-hit kills. So as soon as you see those red dots, you have to take out these enemies not only quickly, firstly, but also make sure that you are clever about getting them to drop those weapons so that then you can properly engage in melee combat. Just like Arkham Asylum. I wonder if there's any hint to a form of a seed being planted here for up-and-coming Batman games, prototypes even, that will then set the standard for superhero games as we know it. And that's where we finally get into probably the biggest advantage, the biggest highlight that I can give the Batman Begins video game, and that has to be this form of reputation fear system that is legitimately clever. And I thought to myself, this is probably, like I said, the predecessor that is probably giving some sort of life, some sort of stepping stone, and it's the stone that this game walked with so that then the Arkham series can run on. Albeit I could be reaching a little bit here, but at the same time, I wouldn't necessarily be all that surprised to learn that maybe some folks on the dev team for this game may have had some kind of induction or maybe ended up jumping from one project to the next and then realized that there's this developer over here named Rocksteady that is currently hiring. And went on over there, and when they heard rumblings of a Batman game being in the works, they probably took some things with them. And this fear reputation system kind of mimics that, where you have these bars in the corners of the screen telling you how far of a reputation you have built within the room of enemies you got. And this reputation system would come into effect mostly when you're dealing with a batch of enemies that are holding guns. But as soon as that prompt up, it's kind of your incentive to then scan your environment and then learn if there's something that, like I said, on the contextual side, you're able to use the D-pad to then cycle through the different interactable elements in the environment. Instantly, the game's going to tell you what you can knock over, what you can grapple, what you can climb. It's not a huge mystery. You don't really have to do any legitimate investigation, but it kind of makes you have this like fun curiosity of like, okay, what happens if I shoot a batarang at this specific little pillar that is just so happens to hold this segment of pipes, and instantly my mind is able to connect the dots and go, this thing's gonna scare the guys into dropping their guns. Shoot the batarang, instantly all these pipes scroll down, and the guys are like, whoa, with like the most expressive character model faces. And that just not only goes for the henchmen, but also Batman himself just doing this thing like this. Again, mid-2000 character models. What can you really do? But this then, of course, created this snowball effect of thought for me to go into the next room and think to myself, what can I blow up? What can I, shoot a batarang to, or maybe pull, or maybe grapple to then pull, and then create this like Rube Goldberg kind of effect, domino effect, so to speak, in order to get these guys scared, to make not only the melee encounters a little faster, make the finishing moves come up a little quicker, but also more importantly, get rid of those goddamn guns. This in turn will then lead to moments where you can either interrogate the last henchman standing, scare him with like this demon bat kind of look animation that I thoroughly liked, even though it brought back again those little quadrant squares that were annoying me. And it's definitely made me think more about how I encounter these moment-to-moment bits of combat in a way that I thought of myself was about to lose me, only to then at least carry me all the way through, anchored my entire experience as a player to the very end of the credits. Sprinkle in some uses of an optical camera cable that you can then use on doors so that you can get a preview of what's awaiting for you inside, or whether or not you should go through that door in the first place, because you got guys literally aiming guns at you and thinking to yourself, okay, there's got to be another like little vent or thing that I can kind of crawl through and stealth my way past, as well as some electrical hack mechanisms to be able to work like a crane or something that requires some sort of hacking mechanism. You literally just line up like little green. It's not that deep. It's really not that deep. But again, for being a mid-2000s game, yeah, you had your moments that were very clunky, very rushed, very undercooked. But then you have this whole system right here, combined with, again, Christian Bale interrogating with certain lines that you would never have expected his version of Batman to say, and yet that serves as just a nice little cherry on top to kind of make my experience of playing this thing worthwhile in a way that made me go, wow, there's some nuggets of gold here that, again, even if a member of this dev team didn't go on to make the Arkham games, there's at least maybe a dev over at Rocksteady circa 2006, 2007 that probably played this and said, hold up, I got an idea. Ultimately, it just led to a better product. Even if the original still had, like I said, that DNA of being a movie tie-in game, which you definitely get by the time you roll the credits, which you have to like manually press. It doesn't even instantly roll the credits for you. You have to like jump into it after the finale, which also made me realize that you still had an awful lot of corners being cut. No true real bosses. I mean, you think that you're fighting bosses in this game like Scarecrow, Ra's al Ghul, both Ra's al Ghuls, both the Liam Neeson and the Ken Watanabe versions, but they still play like regular henchmen that are just in the environment, so you never really get a true sense of a boss fight or boss encounter in an environment. You never really do. Though props for actually highlighting the climax of the film on the train and kind of making this whole kind of maze-style level design that is thoroughly very involved and very intricate built into the climax of this game. mad respect for being able to maximize the real estate of that environment. And after completing the campaign, which takes roughly between 5 to maybe 6 hours, 7 if you take your time, 3 or 4 if you're just trying to go from one end to the next without any skip beats, because you can find long plays on YouTube that are only about 3.5 to 4 hours. It's a movie tie-in game. You have to remember that. And much like an awful lot of other movie tie-in games, you have some quick unlockables that are mainly there to either spice things up because they were just curious little assets that they didn't want to throw away, like this Gallery of Fear thing that's kind of weird. You go down certain wings of Arkham Asylum and you have only bad guys locked up in there that you can then get like bio readings on, and they're cool little reads, and you have the character models kind of in fear, but at the same time I feel like it's strange that you only get the bad guys in there. And when you're not doing that, you can technically swap out Batman's skins for like classic comic book based ones like Batman Inc., Dark Knight, where he's got the yellow symbol but also like the black, like a Hush kind of inspired look to his suit with the blue and the gray and etc. Of course, that's all going to require either something to do with Gallery of Fear or having to replay certain levels of the game. Didn't really feel like doing that. And if you don't, you can technically go in and watch some of these movie clips again, promotional material for the movie as far as like trailers and TV spots, or interviews with the people behind the game to get a sense of how it was made, as well as time trial versions of those Batmobile segments. Again, it really depends on how much of an affinity you have for the franchise Burnout, because they legit play like that. I didn't really feel any personal incentive, but it's cool to see that the devs were careful enough not only to implement those time trial versions because they knew that there was going to be someone out there who loved time trial challenges within Burnout. They're going to have them here with the Batmobile. I still got this benevolent feeling, this vibe from the developers that they still cared about Batman as a property, Batman as a culture, as a phenomenon, even if they still had to kind of marry it with the confines of it being a movie tie-in game. And to bring on some people from the development of the movie on board and kind of get a little bit of a helping hand there, I still had an appreciation for running this game 20 years later when I didn't 20 years back on my days as a child playing on GameCube, playing on PlayStation 2, and I'm glad that I played it. But I definitely do not regret having skipped on it all those years back, knowing that around that time we had powerhouses like Kingdom Hearts and other properties that were just around the horizon, Oblivion, and I was starting to then kind of bring all my focus as a gamer and into that hobby towards that direction. And seeing movie tie-in games going for that full price and only being able to get certain titles for either Christmases or New Year's, I had to make those choices. And though I now have, as a 34-year-old male, have a newfound appreciation and respect for this movie tie-in game, I definitely understand why a 2008 Dark Knight movie tie-in game was also subsequently canceled behind the scenes, because if it wasn't for that, then who knows? Maybe we would have never had Arkham Asylum, my favorite out of the trilogy, out of the Rocksteady main trilogy. In an alternate timeline, who's to say that we could have had a Dark Knight and Dark Knight Rises game? Oh wait, we did have a Dark Knight Rises game. Jesus. Yeah, no, I'm not doing that. I'm not putting myself through that. No, I refuse. But if you guys did manage to play the Batman Begins movie tie-in game back in 2005, let me know down in the comments where you guys' memories of the game. Have you never played it and are enticed to play it through form of original hardware on PS2 or GameCube, or maybe through a form of emulator like I did myself? I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys' experiences were with this really quirky movie tie-in game that ultimately was hilarious, bad at times, but also subsequently incredibly important, whether we realize it or not. Until next time, guys, thank you for watching, and take care.